I remember feeling the grief and trauma of those families really hitting me in the chest. And I rang my partner and I sobbed on the phone and said, I'm never going to get over this. I'm never going to get over this moment of having this realisation.
Welcome to Unseen Chains, Voices Against Human Trafficking. I'm Jessica Moloney, your guide and your host on this profound journey into the shadows of human trafficking. I am the narrator of this 20-minute audio documentary. But before we delve into the heart-wrenching stories and resilient voices, let's start by asking everyday people what they think about human trafficking and what it truly entails.
Human trafficking to me is when people are taken from the street and they are trafficked trafficked across other countries or sold in other ways. That's what I know about it.
When I think of human trafficking, what comes to mind is being plucked off the street in a foreign country or being followed by a white van.
Their answers are as varied as the colours of a global tapestry. Today, we paint that tapestry with the vivid accounts of those who've dedicated their lives to combating human trafficking, as well as their careers. They are going to talk about what they do in their jobs and how it really helps toward combating human trafficking. But first, a word of caution. The stories you're about to hear may be distressing. Human trafficking is a grave issue, but it's essential to shine a light on it. If you or someone you know is in need, please refer to the helpline numbers in the show notes. There are organisations out there fighting this battle daily. So, our first guest is truly remarkable. Dr. Catherine Kate, an international child rights lawyer and deputy head of school at Griffith Law School. Kate's work has made waves globally, particularly her research on orphanage trafficking, which was featured on Foreign Correspondent in 2020. Today, she unveils the harrowing reality of orphanage trafficking in Nepal.
Human trafficking is often associated solely with sex trafficking, but under the international definition, there can be a number of forms of exploitation in human trafficking, and they can be forced labour, they can be sexual exploitation, they can also be things like organ removal and slavery and forms of servitude. So it's not all about the sex trade at all. In fact, in Nepal, of course we see children that are trafficked into the sex trade, but we also see children who are trafficked into orphanages, and we see children who are trafficked into other forms of the entertainment industry, like circuses, for example. The orphanage trafficking happens when children are recruited usually from their biological families, with the promise of education or a better life, into an orphanage or residential care facility. And the purpose of that recruitment is so that the children can be used for funding in that orphanage. So the children are usually not orphans, they're usually posited as orphans or produced as orphans for the purpose of gaining international funding. And that international funding comes from people doing child sponsorship, but it also comes from people going to volunteer in orphanages or even going to watch a performance in orphanages when they go on holidays or on tours. And that's how orphanage trafficking works.
And now, Kate explains how children and their families find themselves ensnared in the intricate web of trafficking.
People are offered the promise of a better life. And when you're living in maybe a far-flung village and you don't have many educational opportunities in that village, you don't have much social infrastructure, if someone comes through the village and offers all the village's children a chance of an education and of a better life, parents, like any parents across the world, want that for their children. So they eagerly grasp it with both hands. Often what happens in orphanage trafficking is that parents will pay the recruiters, believing their children are going off to school, boarding school, in a capital city close by, usually say Kathmandu in Nepal. And that promise of a better life through a better education is what ultimately leads them into an orphanage, and then leads them to them being poorly treated and used to garner funding from international sources.
Wow. It truly is a heart-wrenching journey and really hard to listen to. One that certainly demands our attention and call to action immediately. Hearing these stories makes me personally feel sick to my stomach, and I know many out there feel the same way.
My original story of how I became involved in researching orphanage trafficking is that I was the co-founder of an orphanage in Nepal in 2006. And we started that orphanage because a friend of mine at the time had volunteered in orphanages and seen some terrible corruption, and thought that if we started our own orphanage, it wouldn't be like that. So we started that orphanage, and things went very well. We had 20 young girls in that orphanage, and we visited them every 6 months or so, and we're very proud of them. And then we were approached by another volunteer who was in Uganda in an orphanage, and who had 39 children in this orphanage who were very malnourished and needed help. So we agreed to fund that orphanage, and we went to visit those children, and the situation was really dire. They were drinking water with sugar stirred in it for lunch, and many of them had malaria, and it was just a terrible, terrible situation. So we started sending funding to have those children fed and sent to school. And about 18 months in, we realised that something wasn't quite right, and we had an independent audit done, and we realised that the directors of the orphanage had skimmed about 2,000 Australian dollars off the top of the funding that we were sending. And so we worked with the government of Uganda to close that orphanage and remove the children. And when we removed the children and they came to a safe house, they started asking about their families, and they started telling us that their names had been changed. And when they said those things, we realised something much bigger was going on. And we soon got in touch with their parents, who told us that a pastor had come through their village and recruited the children, saying she was taking them to school in Kampala, which is the capital of Uganda. And then the children were taken to Kampala, their names were changed. She didn't enter them into the school as promised, and instead she put them in an orphanage that she established and then sought international funding for. And those children were kept in really dire straits, I believe, to attract more funding. So it was a really terrible situation. And that then caused us to look at our Nepal orphanage to see what was happening there. And when we looked at Nepal, we didn't have the situation where the children were being kept in dire straits. The children were being kept in very good conditions. They were attending an excellent private school. But when we talked to the children, it appeared that they too had families, and that none of them were orphans. And those children had also been recruited, not by the current orphanage operators, but previous orphanages that they'd come from. They'd been recruited into those orphanages.
It's utterly heartbreaking to hear what Kate has to say, but it's reality and we need to face it. I hope one day Australia can be the reason that these children never have to go to sleep worried or missing their parents ever again.
In relation to orphanage trafficking, I think what Australians need is to be aware that when you sponsor a child that's living in an orphanage overseas, there's a high chance that that child has living parents that could care for them if they were supported themselves. So the global figures are between 2.7 and 5.3 million children living in orphanages globally presently, and that 80% or more have one or both parents alive that could care for them if they were supported. We know that it costs 1/10 of the amount to keep a child at home in their family compared to what it costs to keep them in institutional care. We know that institutional care in orphanages leads to poorer outcomes for children generally. We've got 6 decades of research to prove that. And that's why countries like Australia stepped away from the broad-scale use of residential care a few decades ago. So we have all of this knowledge. We really need to apply it, and Australians need to think critically about how they support vulnerable children in overseas settings. And the best way to do that is to support children who are staying in their communities and in their families. And if they have to be in alternative care, which we know children have to be at times, there's children in Australia that need alternative care outside of their family at times, then that care is in a family environment still, or in kinship care, or something as close to a family environment as can be. And that institutional care, orphanage care, residential care is only ever used for the shortest amount of time possible.
Well, there's certainly a lot of myths out there, and if I've learned one thing from this documentary, it's that I should certainly listen to Kate. And let's continue to debunk these misconceptions together.
Often we see anti-trafficking NGOs using depictions of victims appearing highly distressed in order to get funding for their anti-trafficking programs. And that has programmed us in a way to believe and to see that people who are trafficked are always highly visibly distressed.
I can definitely say that I will be on high alert now when donating to these charities and organisations. A key takeaway from this segment is do your research before donating and make sure you're truly donating to the correct cause and you're not actually endangering these children's lives even further.
People, I think, are under the impression that parents are selling their children into orphanages or into the sex trade, when usually the opposite is true. It's very rare that we see cases of parents selling children. Usually what has happened is the parents really are desiring a better future for their children, and that's how they get caught up in the human trafficking web.
Later, Kate will unveil the barriers preventing victims from seeking assistance, shedding light on the complexities of this dark issue.
Trafficking is categorically a very hard offence to identify and try in a legal setting. There's 2 reasons for that. One is because it's a spectrum offence. You have to prove for child trafficking that there was an act, so there was a recruitment or a transfer or a harbouring of a child, and that was for an exploitative purpose. So the exploitation being sexual exploitation, forced labour, servitude, slavery, debt bondage, those kind of things. And because you have to prove both of those things for child trafficking, what tends to happen is it's easier when a child is found in a very poor situation to just apprehend someone for the exploitation element. So it's easier for police to come into an orphanage and say, these children have been sexually exploited. We will charge the operator with sexual exploitation of children, rather than look at how the children got there in the first place and then try to prove that they were recruited into that orphanage specifically for that purpose of sexual exploitation. Often perpetrators are known to victims, and that's the way that the traffickers initially get in contact with the victims. But those perpetrators might just be the first point of contact. So the other thing to understand about trafficking is it's a continuum. It's not as if, it's not usually that the person who recruits the victim will be the ultimate trafficker. Often they're just middlemen or middle people used to lure the victim, and often they are family members, and they may not be aware of what's really going on. So in the case of orphanage trafficking, they might be thinking that the children really will get a better opportunity. They may realise they're not maybe going to the boarding school that's promised, but they think that the child will have a better life. So they participate in that. There's often money involved too, of course.
listening to Kate's passionate response, it's quite clear that there's hope in the face of adversity. Her dedication to combating orphanage trafficking is nothing short of inspiring. Now, for those of you eager to take action in Australia, there are organisations that provide vital support and resources. You can reach out to organisations such as ECPAT Australia, which focuses on ending the sexual exploitation of children and combating child trafficking. Another excellent option is the Australian Federal Police, which works tirelessly to combat human trafficking and offers resources for victims. Additionally, consider supporting the work of the Australian Red Cross, which provides humanitarian assistance and support to those affected by crises. But our journey doesn't quite end there. Meet Skye Pritchard, a real-life hero working behind the scenes. She's an airline worker who, for privacy reasons, can't actually disclose the airline, but she can reveal the shocking reality of human trafficking in the aviation industry and just what that entails.
Well, as an airline worker, we're trained from the beginning to sort out or suspect human trafficking or even sex trafficking, child trafficking, any sort of trafficking activity. Passengers that may look fearful or disorientated, controlled by others, such as like not letting the child, for instance, speak, or a lot of the time, actually an unusual one is if they're dressed inappropriately for travel, such as like just not wearing appropriate wear, as in like pajamas or something, or going to a really hot climate but wearing really cold stuff. And in a situation like that, normally we work a lot with the Australian Federal Police and we note them straight away. We call also our airline security and note that on their booking, as well as alerting Border Force when they go through customs. Then it does occur often, and you wouldn't think at a little airport like the one I work at Gold Coast Airport, you wouldn't think it happens, but it definitely does, as well as a lot of other trafficking incidents, as well as drug trafficking, child trafficking, but human trafficking obviously as a whole, it does happen very frequent. But it obviously can vary by the region or airline you're in. I know in a lot of other countries it's a lot more common than Australia, however it definitely does happen here. But definitely education and training is so important for all employees, no matter what area, especially you're in with the airport or even just the public in general. I think people need to recognise potential signs and obviously contact your law enforcement and raise awareness among your co-workers, or if you're out in public around anyone, or call the police. But obviously governments and the international organisations play very crucial roles in implementing all these policies and what we're taught to look out for to combat human trafficking on a broader scale.
Skye shares the intricacies of spotting human trafficking and the instances when she had to report it. Prepare to be astonished by just how common this crime is.
I personally have reported one instance where a passenger was not speaking for herself. The gentleman was speaking for her. Really unusual activity. They were flying to New Zealand literally for 7 hours and flying straight back, which is odd in general. Only packing hand luggage and all. Just everything was suspicious. However, noted the booking, it didn't go any further. So in that situation though, it's so important to even note it, even if you just feel one thing and it might not even be right. It's important because you never know what that could turn into.
As we wrap up, remember that human trafficking isn't confined to far off lands. It thrives in our own backyards, and awareness is our greatest weapon against it.
In Australia, for example, are they a worker who is working on a farm and the farmer has taken their passport and they can no longer, they can't leave because they don't have their passport? That's a different situation to the children who have been trafficked into orphanages in Nepal.
The stories you've heard today are powerful reminders of the resilience of the spirit and the urgent need for change. Let's stand together, educate ourselves, and support organisations fighting this battle. Only then can we break the unseen chains that bind so many. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Until next time, let's continue to be voices against human trafficking.